Well, good afternoon. Thank you for having me here in Arkansas. We have enjoyed our time here, and we are from South Carolina, so we get as excited about snow as you guys do. So the first day we got here, we just walked around and we kept calling home. I have a 5-year-old son also. My daughters are with me here today, but we kept calling saying, "Can you see the snow? Can you see the snow?" So we must have called like 10 times, and finally he saw a few flakes, but I'm sure everybody who saw us on the street thought we were just crazy. So thank you so much for having me. Literacy is my area, and it's what I do. But in all the schooling that I've had and all of the training that I've had, I have learned more from the things I do on a daily basis, the things that a lot of times individuals kind of look at and dismiss as not the most important pieces of their lives. A lot of times we look at schooling as the more important part and the formal education, when we get so much valuable education from the things that we do on a daily basis. So I'm going to talk to you about some of those things today. But one of the things, after speaking all over the place and listening to people come and talk to me, I think it's always important that you know who's talking to you. So who's the lady in the stilettos? I want to show you my family, because at the end of the day, aren't they the most important people? So I'm married. I've been married for 18 years to my husband, Will, and I have 3 children. 2 of them are with me. My oldest, Amelia, she's 12. My middle daughter, Macy Bell, is 10, and my son is 5. So we do a lot of really cool, fun stuff at home. They teach me a lot about literacy too, because one of the coolest things about doing what I do and then having children is you get to see those things happen at home. So I get to see right now my son, who is making sense of words and letters and understanding that he's almost ready to read. So all those things that I learned about in my schooling about what kids do when they're ready to read, I see it at home. I saw it with my girls, and I'm seeing it with my son. But this is me at work, okay? So this is actually me in my class teaching content literacy, and I'm teaching students how they can teach their own students how to write 5-paragraph essays using nothing but Post-it notes. All right, 5-paragraph essays tend to be kind of a little bit daunting for some students. It sounds like you're going to have to write a lot, and it is a lot. But if you get students to write them on small pieces of real estate, on little Post-its and note cards, they'll write more, and they don't even realize they've written that much. So one of the things that I do a lot when I talk with teachers is say, you can trick students into writing. You can trick them into reading. You just don't need to tell them up front that this is what we're about to do. Where we mess up is when we say, we're going to write a 5-paragraph essay, and then kids shut down because that sounds hard. But if you don't tell them and you just say, hey, do you think students should be able to bring their cell phones to school? Tell me yes and give me some reasons, and you give them those Post-its to write their notes on. Then you build the whole paragraph and the whole essay on the board, and before you know it, you got a 5-paragraph essay, and no children have been harmed in the process. It's fantastic, okay? So this is me at work. I love teaching. I love it. And I think if I've got to get up and get in full makeup and heels, I'm going to have a good time while I'm there. Now, before I came to the university, I taught at a Title I middle school. And I didn't want to teach there, not because it was Title I, but because it was middle school. And I did not want to teach middle school because middle school children are crazy. And I can say that because I taught them, and I'm currently living with one. But I needed a job. And I graduated in the middle of the year. And there were no jobs at elementary schools, which is where I wanted to be. I knew I didn't want to teach kindergarten. I wanted to teach about 4th or 5th grade. That was my happy place. And there weren't any jobs. So I ended up at a middle school teaching creative writing and one class of South Carolina history. Now, the writing class that I taught, I got new kids every semester or every 9 weeks, and it was what's called an academic exploratory. And what that meant is that I competed with PE and art and music, okay? Because so can you imagine the students, they get the schedule, and they could be in PE, but they're with me in writing. So at the very beginning of every 9 weeks, when I would call roll for every period, I would be missing about 5 students. You know where they were? Guidance, trying to get the schedule changed. All right? And so some of them were successful, And then some would come to me and they would say, well, I talked to Mr. Holsebus in guidance, and he said it's you and nothing because I've already had PE twice. And the art teacher said absolutely no, she wasn't doing this again. And I've had too many discipline referrals to be a student helper, so it's you and nothing. What are we going to do in here? And they were highly disappointed when I said we're going to write every single day. All right? Now, when I first came into this class, I taught writing the way it was taught to me. I put a prompt on the board and I said, go forth and write. And I put prompts on the board that you couldn't possibly mess up. All right? Things like if your house was on fire and you could take 3 things with you, what 3 things would you take and why? Does that sound like a familiar prompt? Yeah. All right. But my students somehow found a way to mess that up because they would ask me things like, does my sister count? Because if I can assume that my mother will take her, then I can get this, this, and this. But if I've got to take her, it's going to be between the iPad or the dog, and I don't know which one to pick. Those were the kind of questions that I would get asked. Or I put a prompt up there one time that said, if you had a time machine and you could go back in time, what time period would you go to and why? And I'm thinking maybe they'll go back to ancient Egypt and see the pyramids being built. Maybe they might want to go and meet Jesus. No. I'm going to go back to last Friday and not do whatever it was that got me on punishment. That's not what I meant, y'all. Or they would sit there at the table and they would say, I can't think of a title for my paper. And I would say, how about blank, because you don't have anything written. But I bought myself a book. It was 365 writing prompts, and I thought, man, I'm good for 2 years. And I put those prompts on the board, and I might have had 2 little children who started writing, and the rest of them gave me ridiculous excuses. And I had one kid who I taught in 7th period who came in late the very first day because he was trying to get his schedule changed. And when he realized he had to be with me, he said, I don't do this writing. I don't write. I'm not a writer. And after about 5, 7, 8, 9 days of him telling me that every single time he walked in class, finally he said, well, you know, Miss Harper, I don't do this kind of writing that you keep talking about, but I write raps because I'm a rapper. And I said, Michael, that's awesome. When do you write these raps? And he said, every day after my mama picks me up from Carline, I go to my room and I write raps, and then she calls me to dinner. And then I go back to my room and I write some more. And I said, Michael, you have got to bring these to me. I want to see them. And he said, oh, Miss Harper, there's some language in there. I said, Michael, I got cussed out last period. This is middle school. Bring them and let me see them. Keep them in your locker until 7th period and then bring them to me. So he did. And this kid, who on day 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of class told me that he was not a writer, brought in stacks of composition notebooks that were full of raps that he was not writing for anybody but himself. I know his mama didn't see them because they did have language in them. But I got to teach synonyms anyway, y'all, okay? So I'm like, how can I use this to teach? So I started thinking about that. How is this kid who tells me he's not a writer, he still provides me evidence of more writing that I've written, and at that time I had a master's. Because see, the type of writing and the type of reading that we're doing in schools is not necessarily the type that we're doing in our daily lives. If you teach, you probably hear students say, what does this have to do with what I'm doing at home? Why do we have to learn this? If you have children, you hear them say, why do I have to learn this at school? Okay, if you can think back to when you were in school, you probably had some of those same thoughts. Why do I need to learn that? And sometimes the only answer that we have is because you need to. But that's not acceptable for all the questions, is it? So I tried to start thinking of ways that I could make whatever my students were already doing linked to whatever I had to teach in the first place. Because if what we're teaching at school doesn't jive with what we're going to be doing in our daily lives and what I'm going to be charged with when I have a career, then why am I teaching? And why am I teaching what I'm teaching? So I started thinking about the way you define reading and writing. So I want you to think about that, okay? If I ask you right now, how many of you consider yourselves readers? Raise your hand if you consider yourself a reader. All right, how many of you consider yourselves writers? All right, did you notice what happened to the number? All right, so almost everybody in here said I'm a reader, but then the number dropped for being a writer. Okay, see, it's easy to prove I'm a reader. Give me a book, I'll read it to you, proof, done. All right, but a lot of students and a lot of adults think in order to be a writer, you have to have written a narrative, you have to have written a story, you have to have written a book, it has to be published. But the amount of writing we're doing on a daily basis, a lot of times, is even more than somebody who writes a narrative, who writes a story, or who writes a book. We do a ton of writing on a daily basis. So I started trying to shift the way that my students looked at how much reading they were doing at home and how much writing they were doing. So when we started making lists of the types of writing that we were doing, a lot of my kids realized, hey, I am writing a lot. Yeah, it's on Facebook and Instagram and that kind of thing, but that's still writing. A lot of our students are writing even more than our teachers are, okay? So I want you to think about this. If you look at these three things, are those writing? You've got a thing written by a first grader, my own personal first grader, that says, if I were president of the United States, I would wear lots of lipstick because I am prissy. I like lipstick. She does live with me, okay? This is the same child who, when my mother brought her a feather duster to dust the furniture, she thought it was a blush brush. So you've got that. You've got a piece from a comic strip, and you got a sleeve tattoo. Are all those writing? It depends upon what your definition of writing is. If your definition of writing is anything that conveys meaning, then absolutely all three of those are. Even that tattoo. That actually is a graduate assistant who I used to work with, and I just passing one day, going to make copies, I saw his sleeve and I said, man, that's a cool sleeve. Tell me something about it. And then 20 minutes later, I'm still standing there getting the whole story because he was telling me what each little thing meant. And this was an entire story on his arm. It had parts from his family, his mother passing away, things he liked to do when he traveled to this other country. That's writing. But now we can't go to the SATs and say, here's my sleeve, except this is my answer, all right? But my point in showing you this is that students have to see that there's more than one way to write, okay? That sleeve conveys meaning. That first grade writing conveys meaning. And so does that comic strip. All that conveys meaning. And then you look at how do we define reading. This is a wordless picture book. So there's no ABC words in there. If a kid opens that book and they flip through it and they tell you the story, are they reading? They are. But there's a whole school of people who would say, I'm sorry, that's not reading because there's no words. What do words mean? Words are nothing but representations of another object, okay? When you see the word B-I-R-D and you know that it's a bird, okay, you're thinking in your head of what a bird is, right? It just represents, it's just a symbol. It's nothing but a symbol for something that already exists. And then you think about like the golf course. Golfers read greens all the time, don't they? Right? You know people who are big weather nuts and they can tell you when the leaves do this certain flip thing, that means a storm's coming. Okay? That's reading the environment. But I wonder if our students know that and if they think about reading that same way. So when you think about the types of literacies that we value in the world, are these the ones? Okay, so you've got an outline for a research paper and a very structured research paper here. All right, how many of you wrote outlines when you were in school? All right, did any of you write a paper and then write the outline? Raise your hand if you did that. If you wrote the paper and then don't be ashamed. All right, some people here are not raising their hand, they're lying. Okay? All right, so here's the deal. If the only strategy you ever learned for organizing a research genre type of paper is the outline, and if 25%, 50%, or whatever percentage of people wrote the paper and then wrote the outline, that's not an effective strategy for everybody. Because I've got news for you. The point of an outline is to write that first. It's supposed to help you plan your paper. But if you're doing it the other way, you're not using that strategy the way that it was intended. So if when we're teaching, if we only teach that one strategy that way, then you're losing how many kids? You lost me because I never wrote an outline before I wrote a paper, ever. No matter what Miss Esserove said to do, okay? All right, and then you've got this Mouse, which is a fantastic graphic novel about World War II and the Holocaust, but the characters are cats and mice. Is that a literacy, a graphic novel? Is that a type of literacy that we value? okay? But then I want you to think about these, all right? So you got social media. You've got this Postit Thinking. All right, this is actually an essay on the floor. If you look at the note card or the top, that's your topic, and those are all your supporting sentences. You've got Facebook, you've got Twitter, you've got Instagram, you've got swamp people. Are all of those literacies that we value? Do we value those as much as somebody who is proficient in writing a research paper? If you're getting ready to hire somebody and you ask them, what kind of writing are you good at? And somebody tells you they're great at writing paragraphs and essays, and then somebody else says, well, I'm great at posting on social media. Who might you hire? You might hire that person who says, I'm great at paragraphs and essays, because sometimes those are the literacies that we elevate. And I think about swamp people, okay? Because if you look on paper, if all of those guys who were on that show provided me with a resume, and I put my Vita next to theirs, you would probably elevate me and say I'm the more educated, right? Because on paper, I've got more letters behind my name. But I'm gonna tell you something, people. If you get lost in a swamp, you don't want to be with me. You will die. I will read you a story, and we will have a good conversation, but we're not gonna make it out, all right? Because these guys possess literacies I can't even fathom. I don't even know what they are. There's no way in the world I could take you out and get you back to wherever we started, but these guys can. But by all traditional ways of viewing people, traditional ways of viewing literacy and who's most educated, it would be me. But I'm not the person you need in that situation. And so when you think about your students and think about today's students, we have a lot of people who are very proficient in multiple literacies that are devalued or undervalued in the classroom. So you think about digital literacies. Do any of you have children around you who are teenagers who can find something online that you couldn't even, it'd take you 2 days to find? All right? I work with teachers all over the place. And one of the things that across the board I've had teachers say to me is students have a hard time with higher order thinking pieces, and they have a hard time with making an inference. Teachers tell me that all the time. But part of the problem is the stuff that we're asking them to infer about or make an inference about is trash. It's boring stuff. All right? They can do it. True story. I'm in a car with 5 or 6 teenage girls. They range in the age of 15 down to 10. My 2 children were in the car. And we were on the way to swim practice. Both of my girls swim year-round competitively. And they had been at a meet before. And one of the girls in the car had caught a nice-looking guy. Just saw him from afar, saw this cute guy, but they didn't catch his name. But they knew that he had dropped 30 seconds in the mile race. So they went online to Meet Mobile, which is the platform that keeps all the race records, and they went to that one event and they found the one young man who dropped 30 seconds in the mile. So bam, now they know this guy's name, and now they know what team he's on, and now they know what city he lives in, and within about 5 minutes they had found every social media account this kid had, and had proceeded to proclaim to me that he did not have a girlfriend. And I said, how do you know this? And so one of the girls said, oh, Miss Harper, it's easy. So he posts lots of stuff on Instagram, but it's with different girls. It's never the same girl. And when you look at the captions are very generic and friendly. It never says anything about this is my girlfriend. It's always very, friend-oriented. And then we read his bio, and his bio didn't say anything about a girlfriend. And then he didn't have a lock next to his name, which indicates he's locked down or in a relationship. And I said, you made an inference. And they said, no, we didn't. I said, yeah, you did. And they're like, no, we didn't. And I said, yes, you did. Tell me where it explicitly says in any posting that he does not have a girlfriend. And they just they said, well, we can't, well, and there you go. You just made an inference. They gave me textual evidence to back up why they thought this guy did not have a girlfriend, but they didn't have anything that explicitly said, hey, I don't have a girlfriend. That's an inference, y'all. But those are the same kids that their teachers will tell me in professional development can't make an inference. Yes, they can, and they can research too, because you think of all the research they had to do to find this guy. But see, here's the thing, they don't call it research in the real world, they call it just looking it up. So when you say to students, you just did some research, a lot of times they'll say, no, I didn't, I just looked it up. Sometimes the way we talk about it is different. The way we talk about it in school, the academic language we use is different than the type of language that we use in the real world. We don't say after you've read a book, and you know your friend has read this book, you don't say, could you give me a summary on that book? No. You just say, can you tell me about it? But in school, we say, I need a summary on that book. We got to talk about it in the real world. How do we express this in the real world? So when you think about today's students, okay, remember this is a generation that they showed up and they get a ribbon. Everybody on the team, okay? And I'll tell you my own personal children, we did the science fair because you're supposed to do the science fair. And you get a certificate. And sometimes they place and sometimes they don't. But even when they didn't place, they got these certificates that said participation. And I sat there when they were at the bar and said, girls, you see these that say participation? They're going in the trash because you don't get a certificate for doing what you should have done in the first place. Now, either they will be well-adjusted adults or they'll need therapy. The jury is still out. But at the end of the day, you don't get a certificate for just showing up. You've got to do more. Today's students have that instant gratification. If you have a question, you don't have to go to the library anymore. You just have to get on your smartphone. Today's generation does not know what it's like to have a question and to have to decide if it's the most important question enough for you to actually go to the library and look it up. They don't have to decide that. They can just look it up on their phone. And then you have students who are super, super literal. All right? So that milk carton, this is another true story. My middle daughter, we were at the beach at another literacy conference, and she had that milk carton, and my mother-in-law looked over there at her, and she was doing this to the milk carton. Why? Because it says pet to open. Okay? Extremely literal. And I said, Macy Bell, at what point do you think that you would ever pet a milk carton and it would just open? But don't you see students doing things like that? They don't understand idioms or expressions, okay? So thinking about today's students. But I'm going to tell you that after all the schooling and after all the things that I've read, the things I've learned most about literacy have come from very unlikely sources, like pinball machines, okay? So my father was a pinball fanatic, all right? We had pinball machines from the time, I was a baby. We always had them. And we didn't have new pinball machines. We had the old ones from the 50s and the 60s and even the 40s. And so I had all this history, and I knew that a pinball machine and a flipping machine are two different things, okay? And the reason that flippers would put on pinball machines was to make them legal, because the other was a possible gambling thing, because you shoot the ball up and you would bet. But when my father, that was just normal for us. We always had that. And my father could fix them. This is a schematic I found of the actual relays and the layout of that particular machine. And this is another operating manual I found in my father's stuff. And I used to pick on my father and tell him that when something happened to him, when he died, none of these machines would ever get fixed, because he was the only person who knew how to work on them. And I'm here to tell you, by George, that is 100% accurate. Because when my father died in 2011, I can't find a soul that knows how to work on these old machines, because they don't possess the literacies they need to be able to fix this. Now, my father would be considered by many as one of those that's uneducated. He had a GED. He dropped out of high school. He had some electrician classes that he picked up at the technical school, but he didn't need them. He took them because the jobs that he was applying for required those kind of certifications. But in reality, my father had been building circuits since he was probably 6 years old. We had the coolest science projects. The coolest science projects. One year, he hooked our Christmas tree up to the radio. When you turned the radio on, the tree would come on. That was just normal at my house. That was just normal. But he was self-taught. But again, in school, he would have been one of those kids that was underperforming, okay? When he died, I found this. This is some kind of schematic that's supposed to explain to me how the power system works on the golf cart. I don't have a clue. And in fact, when I took that same golf cart to get it fixed, the guy who looked at it said, I have no idea how he hooked this up, but it works. But again, my father would have been one of those people who would have been viewed as underperforming, didn't have sufficient skills, below basic, because he didn't have the academic literacies that we elevate in our schools. All right, so I want you to look at this piece of writing. Just by looking at it, can you tell me how much planning you think you went into this writing? What do you think? Does it look like a lot of planning? No? Does it look polished? Does it look well thought out? Okay. Would you believe this is one of my best writings? You see revising? Okay. This is my mother's eulogy. It's a hot mess, isn't it? Okay? This piece of writing, I wrote in my head for almost 4 months. Okay? So my mother was an educator, and about 2 years ago, she was diagnosed with brain cancer in September, actually, of 2016. And when my mother had her biopsy and the neurosurgeon came out and told us what it was, I knew she was going to die. I knew right then. And so I started writing her eulogy in my head that day, September the 8th. And I wrote that eulogy in my head at different parts during those almost 4 months before she passed away in December. So I wrote it in my head in car line when I had to wait to pick up my children. And I wrote it in my head on a plane to Little Rock, Arkansas in November of 2016 when I couldn't sleep at night, when it was the middle of the day and it was quiet, just at different times. And so I knew what I was going to say because I had written it in my head for almost 4 months. But I did not sit down and put pen to paper until the day after she died, on the 21st of December, because I knew I had to deliver her eulogy on the 22nd at her funeral. So if you look at that, there's no way for you to be able to measure the amount of thinking and planning that went into that. But that's 4 months of planning in my head. And if you think about in school, even when I was teaching, I thought about writing as a very linear process. You brainstorm, you draft, you revise, you publish. But writing doesn't work that way. It's recursive. You flow back and forth. And I even counted off for my students when they didn't show evidence of brainstorming. So if I were in my own class, I would have lost points because I don't have any kind of brainstorming there. And that doesn't look polished. But when I say to you that I spent more time planning that than I did on my dissertation, I'm being honest with you. And so all these arrows and things, that's notes to myself, notes of what to say, things that I knew I wanted to include, and then even things that I put in there that I knew I couldn't say once I got up there because I tried to remember all the funny things that happened. And one of the things that my mother said to me after she was diagnosed and they told her they were going to put her on chemo and do radiation is they give her this piece of paper that tells all the things you can and can't do when you're on chemo. And my mother was 60, okay? So she says to me in the hospital room, she goes, "Hey, good news, Rebecca, I can still take birth control." And I said, "Good news, Mama, you don't need it." And so that was one of the things that I had written down that I was going to say at her eulogy. And you can see that if you look closely, but when I stood up at the podium at the Baptist church in South Carolina, and I looked out at all the people that I was going to be talking to, I knew that my mother would have my behind if I said birth control in the middle of the church. So I left that part off. But again, isn't that evidence of revising in my head? The only way that you would know how much planning went into this is to have a conversation with me. And here's the other thing too. Out of all the things that I've written, my dissertation that I wrote, that's the biggest thing that I've ever written, I don't ever think about what I needed to do to make it better because it was something that I did. It was a means to an end. I had to do it to finish my degree. But I'm going to tell you, about every month, I think of something I should have said there, because that's a piece of writing that's powerful, and it's important to me, and it made sense to my life. I wonder how many literacy engagements we give our students that are that powerful, that they want to come back and revisit, that they can't help but come back and revisit. Like if I had it to do over again, I would include the part about how I used to always tease my mother and say I would send her to the retirement home Shady Pines from the Golden Girls. I left that part out. I forgot. And I won't get to say that, but I will continue to think and revise because of how powerful that piece of literacy is for me. Something else that I think about that's changed the way that I look at writing. Things like this on ESPN. Okay, remember, I had students who didn't want to write and didn't want to be with me and couldn't see the connection. But all of these things that are on regular TV are nothing but writing and literacy engagements. Pardon the interruption, which is nothing more than two commentators going back and forth over the topics in sports, is nothing but an oral argument. And that list on the right-hand side that's called the rundown, in school we call those topics. We got to find out some better words, y'all. It would sound so much more exciting if we, instead of calling it the topics that we're going to talk about, the rundown of the day. That doesn't sound as school-ish, okay? Outside the lines, that's nothing but the behind-the-scenes stories of your football team or your football player, okay? We have to teach biographies in school. Why not teach them that way? And the top 10 plays and sports recaps are nothing but summaries. If you go to the SEC network on Monday and you look at the 2-minute replay or the 2-minute recap of the South Carolina game, it's nothing but a summary. You ask students, what do they include? They include the turnovers, the touchdowns, the injuries, the penalties. Why? Those are important details, which is exactly what we ask students to do when we ask them to write a summary of a novel, the important details. And the top 10 plays, you've only got 2 or 3 sentences to tell me about this top play. You've got to summarize it. All of those things are great ways for students to see that the things that I'm trying to teach them in school, they need in the real world. And here's an example of it in the real world. So what does this mean for literacy? At the end of the day, whether you are a professor, a mama, a businessman, whatever you do, at the heart of what you do is literacy, whether you realize that or not. Because everything about how we make sense of the world that we live in is based on principles of literacy. The way that we discuss items, the way that we represent them visually, the way that we write about them, the way that we talk about them. So literacy is not something just for the teachers to do. It's not something just for the English teachers to do. It's something that we all do. And if we can explain to students and to people in general that what you're doing already is informed by literacy practices, that is entrenched in literacy practices, then it can allow individuals to see that what they're doing and the skills they possess make them literate individuals. You don't have to be an academic to be literate. You just have to be, because everything you do is surrounded by literacy. So thank you so much for letting me talk about what I love and the great part of my job. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca. Okay, we have time for a couple of questions, if anyone has one. Surely there's somebody here with it. There he is. There you go, Alex.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. My name is Alex. I'm also a first-year student here. My question is, how do you bring in these strategies, say in a university setting where there might be traditional and non-traditional students? Mm-hmm. And then how do we cross some of those cultural barriers that we sometimes find as well using some of these strategies?
Well, I think first of all, the first thing you've got to do is you've got to know your students, okay? And I was asked earlier today how the way that I teach at the university is different from the way that I teach in the middle school, and it's really not that different. At the end of the day, whether you are 12 or 22 or 50, you want the person who's charged with being your instructor to be interested in you and to feel like whatever is going on in your life is important. So one of the things that I do with every class that I teach is I try to get to know the people who I'm looking at. And I ask them questions about what they're interested in, what's their background, and then I offer opportunities for them to come in and bring pieces of whether it's their cultural background or their work background or their family. And I think that helps build that classroom culture that is so important, and having that safe environment. Because at the end of the day, my job is not just to educate, but to also allow my students, no matter how old they are, and whether they're grown or not, to have a safe spot to land, and to know that my classroom is a safe space. I don't pretend to know everything about every culture or every individual, but that's why I love working with my students, because then they can teach me. So I think giving students also the opportunity to be the expert, to say, I don't really understand this, can you help me because you're the expert, is another way that we can do that. But I think at the end of the day, you got to know who you're teaching, and that's going to help you make sure that you're bringing in the right strategies, that you're bringing in the right material, so that it's going to address the needs and the actual classroom student that you have. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Question right there.
How do you recommend that with such structured initiatives and with such standards-based education and assessment-driven education that we can bring this into especially our schools that need the most support in their instructional practices? How do we change and shift that culture within them?
You know, that's a hard thing, because so many schools have shifted to scripted programs because they're supposed to be teacher-proof, like we can't mess them up. And so they basically are saying, this is what you ask and this is what the students should say. And you don't need a teacher for that. You just need someone who can read. That's not what a teacher is. And that's a question that I get from my students a lot, especially if they have administrators or districts that are pushing programs with fidelity and implementation with fidelity. At the end of the day, you've got to teach your students. You're not teaching the curriculum, you're teaching your students. And if you teach the right way, and if you teach your students, I could blow up the standards and put them on that back wall behind me, and I could have darts, and I could throw them, and I could hit the standards based on the way that I teach. It might not be lined the way that the curriculum map is laid out, but I guarantee you those kids are going to learn more than they ever would from a scripted program, because at the end of the day, if you've got a bachelor's degree and you're reading off of a script, really? You don't need somebody who has a degree. You just need someone who can read. That's not what teaching is. And if you go into a classroom like that, and then you go into a classroom that has authentic literacy practices, there's a stark difference. And the performance is different too. Is different too. As far as the assessment, all of these things, the way that I teach, you can still assess, and you can still have those, stringent standards-based assessments. But the quality of learning that's going to get to that assessment is going to be far superior than anything you would get from saying, teacher says this, student's supposed to say this. I think you've got to be informed, and that's one thing that teachers, I don't think, have as much in their pocket when they go to a principal and say, this program is not working. They don't always have the research and the reasoning behind why it's not working. If you're informed and you're well-read and you can articulate why, that's your ammunition right there. It's when teachers go in and say, I just don't like this scripted program. But if you can articulate and have a well-structured argument as to why this doesn't work, and you have the research behind it, and you've looked at that program with a critical eye, your administrator would behoove them to listen to you, because you know your stuff. You got to be informed, though.
Yes, question right here.
You addressed reading and writing in terms of literacy. What about oral language development at the secondary level? How do you address that in terms of receptive and expressive language?
I think it's so important for you to allow students time to discuss and have productive discourse. And one thing that I notice with working with teachers is when time is given for students to have that kind of discussion and that kind of productive discourse, there's a little bit of a scare factor as far as, like, if my principal walks by and they see in the class and they're talking and it's loud, I don't have control. But in a lot of instances, the class that's having those discussions compared to the one that's in the row where I'm standing and delivering, that class that's having the discussions is learning more. Because we learn through our speech, right, and discussion. And the way that we work through problems and such are through different literacy practices. So you have a lot of students who can process things better because they write things out. You might have some that have to repeat it back to you. You might have some that have to discuss with you. I mean, you think about it as a real person. If you've ever had an issue, you had a problem with somebody, and you call a friend or you call your mom or whomever, and you say, I'm having this issue at work, what should I do? And you keep talking and talking and talking, and they don't really get a chance to say anything. And really, part of you working it out was just you talking it out, not necessarily your mama telling you what to do, but you telling them. So there's value in discourse, but we don't give our students enough time to do that. So students have got to talk. And we have a ton of students who make it to be seniors in high school, and they have to do a presentation or a senior speech, and they just shut down. I see students like that when I was teaching undergrads, when I first came to the university. And we would have student presentations, and they would, I'm telling you, just freak out about having to speak in front of the class. And I said to my students, you do understand what program this is, right? You understand that from this point on, you're going to be speaking in front of crowds for the rest of your life as part of your career. That's what teachers do. And if you can't talk in front of the 15 of us and we're all good friends, your career is going to be hard. But we haven't given them the opportunity to do those kinds of things. You're welcome.
Anything else? Well, let's thank Rebecca, and please come visit with her as she signs Writing That Rocks and Works. Rebecca Harper, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.